Before we get started, I want to let you know that CityCast Chicago is hiring. We're looking for a senior account executive to join our revenue team. We already know you love the podcast and the newsletter, so if you got some sales experience and you know Chicago, you want to help local businesses get their message out to the best audience in the city, you should apply. As you can probably tell, we have a lot of fun over here. You can get all the details, including compensation, at citycast.fm/jobs. Today on CityCast Chicago, maybe you're tired of the same old burgers and brats at the 4th of July cookout, or you're looking for something really unique to feed your out-of-town visitors. Well, food writers Monica Eng and David Hammond have a whole book dedicated to true Chicago foods, and not just hot dogs and deep dish. It's called Made in Chicago, Stories Behind 30 Great Hometown Bites, and they told us earlier this year which dishes we have to try. It's Monday, July 3rd. I'm Jacoby Cochran, and this is what Chicago's talking about. David, Monica, thank y'all. David, I know this is your first time on CityCast Chicago. Monica, this is your 11th time. Welcome back to CityCast.
Thanks so much.
Glad to be here.
David, can you tell me about your love for Chicago foods? How far back does it go, and how much does it have your heart?
Oh, it goes back to the 1950s when I first started eating Chicago food.
Come on.
And I was interested in exploring some of the foods that I did grow up with.
Okay. Most
of which are still around, like the Chicago corn roll tamale, which I think is a good example of a food that I do not consider awesome, but it is a Chicago favorite. And when I was a kid, I really liked them because they were the least expensive thing I could buy at a hot dog vendor. Monica, I don't know when's the last time you got a Chicago corn roll tamale, but at Johnny's, they're like $1.98 or something for...
What?
I know, it's crazy.
Inflation. I do remember when they were like 10 cents.
Yeah, right. That's how I remember them. And I also remember them as being, and you find this at some places, a bunch Chicago corn roll tamale. There's like this origami maneuver that's made so that you get, instead of one big tamale, you get like 4 little tamales, little baby tamales. And they seem to be, I don't know why this is, but they seem to be more luscious somehow. Maybe greasy is another word for it. But they seem to go down easier than that big carbohydrate tube of a regular Chicago corn roll tamale, which I do think there are good applications of. I think the best application is in chili itself. You treat it just like a dumpling. Dice the corn roll tamale up, throw it in chili, which is called a tamale boat at some places in Chicago.
You putting me on right now, David, because I'm going to be real. I had never heard or have never even had a corn roll tamale in my life.
What?
I'm kind of glad to hear that, because that means the book will have news for you.
Yeah.
No, there are a few things as I go through the table of contents and I look at these 30. There are things that I know but have never eaten and would never eat. We'll talk about those. There are some that I've never heard of, but then there are ones that they know me, like we're best friends. Give me a chapter 23 smothered in a chapter 20, and that's a pizza puff covered in mild sauce, and we good. But I gotta ask y'all, Mom, what's your favorite thing to eat from this book?
Well, look, dude, I'm a Puerto Rican, and so I gotta go with the jibarito.
Describe it for people.
Okay, so think of a steak sandwich, and really you can put anything in the middle, but think of a steak sandwich with griddled ribeye and some mayo and some lettuce and tomato and American cheese. Okay, not the greatest. But instead of using a roll, you take 2 green plantains, slice them lengthwise, fry them, smash them, and refry them until they're like a big, nutty French fry, and then smear them with garlic, and then make that the bread on your steak sandwich. And then you crunch it all together, and it's the most wonderful combination of kind of salty and sweet and crunchy and cool and meaty and greasy that you've ever had.
You can literally describe anything with a sort of visual competence. I've once heard you describe the inside of a corroding lead pipe, and I was taken aback. Listening to you talk about a Jibarito, I shouldn't have just had water this morning, because this is a terrible conversation to go into on an empty stomach. And Monica, you already making me regret my decision. David, what's that food for you that you can't help but love?
I have an old favorite and a new favorite. The old favorite is probably the Italian beef. When I was growing up, I was born in Chicago, lived in Chicago until about 5th grade. Then we moved to Elmhurst. Then I lived back in Chicago. In Elmhurst is where I was introduced to the Italian beef sandwich. I love beef. I'm really kind of embarrassed to say. I mean, we should all be eating less beef. I should be eating, my cholesterol's high. I'm taking pills for that. So it's not something you can eat very often. And I find that it's best to eat in the summertime because, again, a lot of these foods are a little bit messy to eat. And I can eat them in my car, most of them. The sweet steak sandwich I could not eat in my car.
Nah, that one get a little messy.
Fortunately, it was a warm day, so I could eat al tronco. Yeah, the Italian beef, which I really feel we have the Italian beef, the Chicago hot dog, and the deep dish pizza. Those are like the triumvirate, the trinity of the 3 major Chicago foods.
How do you like yours prepared, right? Most Italian beefs, right? Hoagie roll, thinly sliced beef, some giardiniera, but how do you like yours prepared in particular?
Hot and sweet dipped.
Hot and sweet dipped. All right.
That is, I want it dipped. And dipped is a little bit, I mean, I had to work up to that. The first Italian beefs I had were not dipped. They weren't dry either. They put a little jus on there.
A little bit.
But now I'm ready. I like it when the consistency inside the roll it has kind of like the consistency of shaving cream. I mean, it's kind of fluffy and soft. I mean, that may sound revolting to some, but it's the way I've grown to love it.
This episode is brought to you by FX's The Bear. The hit series returns with Jeremy Allen White in the Golden Globe-winning role of Carmy. He and the team will transform their family sandwich shop into a next-level spot, all while being forced to come together in new ways as they confront their past and reckon with who they want to be in the future. FX is The Bear. All episodes now streaming, only on Hulu.
This episode is brought to you by Certified Piedmontese Beef. Listen up, foodies. Make your next meal even better with real Nebraska beef. They have healthy, tender, delicious Italian heritage beef, grass-fed and sustainably raised on lush pastures in the Midwest. You can even create your own personally curated meat box that's shipped right to your door. To get 2 free steaks with any purchase over $50, use the code FREEBEEF at checkout. Learn more and shop exclusively at cpbeef.com.
Is there a story of how a food came to be that was extremely fascinating to you that maybe you didn't know before the book or you were so excited to get into the book? Monica, is there an origin story that you really love?
Well, I really love the origin story for the sweet steak, but possibly my favorite was the pizza puff.
Okay, come on.
There was a man named Eli Shabazz who sold old baby buggies that he turned into hot dog carts at the turn of the century. You put a Bunsen burner under there and you can turn a baby buggy into a hot dog cart. That's how hot dogs were sold in Chicago. And so every week he would go to his customers and say, hey, you need to pay me for the rental of the cart and the equipment that I sell you. And one week, the widow of one of his customers said, I'm so sorry, my husband's died. I have nothing I can give to you except this recipe for corn roll tamales. And he started what's called Il Taco, Illinois Tamale Company. Going along, and his sons take over the business, and they're delivering hot dog equipment to now the places that sell hot dogs, which are hot dog stands, which have this new thing called a fryer because they're frying hot dogs. And they're like, but I'm getting killed by this new thing called pizzerias. How can we possibly compete against this new thing called pizzerias? And he said, oh, well, let me think about it. So as they're making their tamales, they're sitting around saying, let's mess around with some flour tortillas. We've got a Mexican-American population here, so let's get some flour tortillas. Maybe let's throw some sausage and some tomato sauce and some cheese in here. Finally, they perfected it, and it works so well. It becomes like fluffy, flaky puff pastry when you put it in that fryer. So I thought that was a wonderful comment on how Chicago fast food progressed since the beginning of the 20th century and how all those things came together. The hot dog stand, the push carts, the French fries, the tamales, and then the pizza puff, all invented by immigrants.
I really appreciate, again, y'all taking my nostalgia for loving these foods, whether it's rib tips or pizza puff or even a rainbow cone, and just providing this next layer. I'm not going to be able to eat these foods the same again because now I'll just have this deeper story. Were there any foods on this list that you did not know anything about before deciding to narrow it down, David?
Well, one food that I didn't know anything about because it's offered on the South Side is the sweet steak. I hadn't had one before. I have had one since. In fact, just 2 weeks ago, my wife and I drove to the South Side, went to Home of the Hoagie. And this I found to be kind of an interesting situation. We walked in at about 2 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon, perhaps the worst time to go to a place like Home of the Hoagie. We walked into a room with about 24. I mean, people were coming and going and putting in order and leaving them there. I mean, it was not a big room. So we asked the lady, we walked up to a lady, we'd put in our order, walked up to a lady and said, so how long do you think it's going to be? And she said, about an hour. And we were like, oh, geez, okay. Ended up being 90 minutes for a sandwich. I don't think I've ever waited 90 minutes for any food of any sort. I'm glad I did because it gave me a chance to, eat this delicious sandwich on a warm afternoon. But what drives people to do that? And the one conclusion I came to, and maybe not the right one, but one, is that it's their thing. Sweet sandwich is a South Side thing. People are kind of proud of it, and it appeals to this sense of food tribalism, which also covers certain dislikes and hatreds. For instance, ketchup on a hot dog in Chicago. I think Chicagoans are borderline pathological about their hatred of ketchup on a hot dog.
I love ketchup on a hot dog, and I'll put these hands up against anybody. I'll fight anybody.
Good for you, man.
Who wants to tell me what to take off my hot dog?
Yeah, and Chicagoans will put all kinds of ungodly stuff into their mouths, but suddenly with ketchup, they get all principled and, oh, no.
I think people pretend. I think they generate outrage about it.
I do, too.
There are a few foods on this list that I'm familiar with, but I've never actually eaten. So like a bone-in pork chop sandwich from Maxwell's. When I go to Maxwell's, I want a burger covered in grilled onions.
Burger, not a Polish?
I get it sometimes, but that Maxwell burger covered in them onions, it just do something different. But there are some on here, whether it's Chapter 1, Akutagawa. I'd never even heard of this. Chapter 11, Flaming Saganaki. Monica, you know a lot about a lot of things. It's the reason we've had you on the show 50-11 times. Is there anything on this list that you were not familiar with before going into the process?
Well, I hadn't eaten a sweet steak before I started, and so that was new for me. I'm trying to think. The Akutagawa I had had before, but I loved that story that talked about people who were forcibly interned during World War II and then forcibly relocated away from California. Chicago was one of the biggest spots where they were forcibly relocated and told to stop being Japanese. Do not congregate together. Do not act Japanese for your own good. And I loved that the Akutagawa represented sort of slyly trying to still be Japanese in Wrigleyville when you were told to cut it out. And so, a place called Hamburger King, the Sato family was just like, okay, we are going to act as American as possible. We're opening up a restaurant called Hamburger King. But, you have George Akutagawa coming in from the Nisei Lounge, a regular, and saying, hey, could you make me some of those eggs? And could you throw in some hamburger and green pepper and onion and some bean sprouts? And then I can have something that is sort of secretly Japanese. And then everyone's like, I'll have what he's ordering. What do we call it? And still today, in that spot, they're serving the Akutagawa and in other places where other chefs have gone. And so, I had no idea that investigations of these dishes would yield these rich stories that tell you about Chicago's past, that tell you about different waves of migration and different cultures. But they ended up, serving up these delicious stories of history.
Mm-hmm. As you move through this list, you see things that even though plenty of Chicagoans have eaten them, you say this feels, special to, Japanese Americans living here. There's some special for Puerto Ricans who are living in Chicago, for working class Italians and Irish folks, for Black folks who are going to put mild sauce on. Honestly, pretty much anything on this list, we'll probably eat it. Often the story of food is the story of community, is the story of migration. To live in a city that is so known for its segregation, what is it like to write a book about the foods that bring us together?
I'd like to believe that these foods bring us all together, but what struck me in a really sad way, and I didn't want to bring people down in the book, is how these foods really pointed to our segregation. You ask someone on the far north side, hey, have you tried steak and lemonade or a gym shoe? They'd be like, steak and what? And a what? You ask someone on the far south side, have you tried an Akutagawa? What are you talking about? We have these foods that are delicious that really say North and South, different cultures. And what we really hope is this book will tell you, hey, this is all Chicago. You should learn about all these foods. You should go into another part of town that you've never been to because there's delicious stuff there. Delicious stuff that even other states are eating. There are steak and lemonade joints in Kentucky. And there are gym shoes that are served in Wisconsin. There are jibaritos that are served in Ohio. And yet people across town, maybe they've never heard of them. I'm hoping that this book can bring us all together and say, hey, you want to be a Chicagoan? Check off 30 of these things on your list, and it will bring you to parts of the city that you may never have been, and it will allow you to taste the flavors of your fellow Chicagoans and maybe get to know them better through that at least.
But you're right. When I was growing up, I just knew pizza puffs and rib tips. I had never heard of, gampong chicken wings. I had never heard of the corn roll tamale, or this just pretty much like fried cheese that you can get over in Greektown, right? The saganaki. So there were so many things on here that I had heard of, I knew of, or I had never known. And you're right. You go to different parts of the city and the mild sauce that's not mild sauce. I got to go back south of Roosevelt to get what I'm looking for. So I'm glad that this book can both find ways to encourage people to leave their neighborhood while simultaneously giving a nod to the nostalgia of the things we grew up with. So I really appreciate that. There are plenty of foods on this list that I imagine as long as Chicago is Chicago, these foods will be around. Yeah. Are there any on this list, though, that you think over the last few years or even the last couple of decades that just it sort of maybe slowly faded from most people's memory and even some popular menus, and it's just harder to get than ever before?
I think maybe the Akutagawa, it's still at least 2 places, but if Rice and Bread, which is in the current location of the Hamburger King, ever closes, it may fade. I was worried that the Rainbow Cone would fade, but who knew that they would actually start expanding into Buona Beefs and other places in recent years, because it could have really died out as just this far south side outpost. How about you, David?
You better get your flaming cheese while you can.
Oh, come on.
Because I think that is on the way out, and I'll tell you why. There's this guy, Alexakis. He owns the Avli Tavernas and Avli on the Park. They're Greek restaurants. And he served a flaming cheese, flaming saganaki, which was popularized probably in the 70s at either Diana's or the Parthenon. I kind of tend toward Diana's, but a lot of people think the Parthenon came up with this flaming saganaki. At Avli on the Park, which is in Lincoln Park, he does not serve his saganaki flaming. He puts a little peppered fig on top. However, he has a location in Winnetka, a little bit more conservative, maybe older people. So he's serving
more pyromaniacs.
Right. So he's serving the flaming cheese up there, but not in the newer, hipper location. So I think that maybe, and this is not something you'd see in Greece either. This is a Chicago thing. Flaming saganaki, it's an appetizer. You've heard it, like, you've been to Greek restaurants where people say, "Opa," they're flaming the cheese. It's kind of traditional. And I think for those people who've grown up with that, as I have, if you don't have the flaming cheese before dinner, you feel empty inside. You're missing something. The experience is not complete.
Monica Eng and David Hammond are the co-authors of Made in Chicago, stories behind 30 great hometown bites. We appreciate y'all making time for CityCast Chicago today.
Hey, great being here, Jacoby.
Thanks so much, Jacoby.
Before I let you go, a little bit of news, y'all. More construction is coming as the Blue Line Forest Park branch is set to begin construction later this month, according to CTA President Dorval Carter. The Clinton, UIC Halsted, and Racine stops are expected to close through October as CTA replaces outdated tracks and demolishes and rebuilds the Racine stop. In other construction news, the University of Chicago has received state approval to start building a 7-story, $815 million cancer care and research facility on campus. I know you got plenty of options for 4th of July celebrations tomorrow, but there are parades happening in Hyde Park, Irving Park, and Sauganash. For more info, you can check the show notes. There's some good news. After the cookouts, head over to the inaugural Sounds of the South Music Fest in Pilsen. They got 2 stages with artists and DJs playing from 3 to 10. You already know where we got the ticket links for you. Yup, the show notes. We gonna be off tomorrow, but we'll be back in your inbox and feeds Wednesday when I'm taking you to the roller rink. Yes, lead producer Simone Alisea is getting a lesson from none other than my mother. I'll talk to you Wednesday. Peace.